meant something to me. I put my hand down, pulled my notes toward me, and went back to work. They faced cadets, and the galaxy learned how humans train. The Keth commander pointed at us before the assembly hall had even gone quiet. His name was Drath Voss. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his body wrapped in natural silicon plating that caught the light like polished stone. He had 3 rows of medals across his chest, and the kind of posture that said he had never once lost anything he wanted to keep. The assembly hall of the Galactic Union Military Academy held over 4,000 cadets that evening from 11 different species, and every single one of them turned to look when Drath Voss raised his hand and pointed directly at the human section. I was standing in that section. 3rd row. My name is Mira Vasquez. I was 22 years old, and I had not slept well in about 6 months. I request, Drath Voss said, his translator collar rendering his words in clean, flat standard, that the human delegation be placed in my bracket for the Apex War Games. The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your chest. Then the hall began to laugh. Not all of it. The Vral cadets, tall, forearmed, mathematically perfect in everything they did not laugh. They watched. The Soon cadets, small and copper-skinned and faster than anything alive, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But the Keth laughed, and the Dorothy laughed, and a number of others joined in because laughter, in almost every species, is contagious. Drath Voss let it go on for a moment. Then he spoke again. I wish to offer them a fair chance before they are placed against real competition. More laughter. I looked at my team. Yusuf Carver was to my left, arms folded, jaw set, saying nothing. Priya Holloway was 2 seats down, and she was writing something on her training pad with the focused energy of someone who had just been handed a reason. Daejung Mercer sat directly behind me, and when I glanced back at him, he gave me the smallest possible nod, the kind that means we already knew this, and now we are going to do something about it. The Academy Commandant, an ancient Vral named Instructor Seal, stood at the front of the hall and watched all of this with her 4 pale eyes. She let the laughter die on its own. Then she said, without any expression at all, the request is granted. Human Delegation Bracket 3. War Games begin in 21 days. That was it. I had come to the Galactic Union Military Academy because I earned my place there. Every human who walked through those doors had earned it. We were the newest member species of the Union, admitted only 40 years ago, and in those 40 years we had heard every variation of the same quiet dismissal. The soft ones, the emotional ones, the ones who had only just figured out faster than light travel, when the rest of the galaxy had been using it for centuries. We were used to it. What the rest of the galaxy had not yet figured out was that being used to something and accepting it are 2 very different things. I had read everything about the Apex War Games on the journey to this station. 72 hours of continuous operation in a simulated combat environment. Live fire stun weaponry, real terrain, real exhaustion, no resets, no pause points, no mercy provisions. The winning team from each annual games went into the record hall and stayed there forever. The Keth had won 11 consecutive years. 11 years of pointed at, laughed at, dismissed. I stood in that assembly hall with the echo of 4,000 voices still fading around me, and I felt something settle in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. Not anger. Something quieter than anger and considerably more dangerous. I turned to Yusuf when the assembly broke. He was already looking at me. 21 days, he said. 21 days, I agreed. We walked back through the corridor toward the human barracks, and Priya fell into step beside me and held up her training pad. She had already begun writing a preparation schedule. The first line read, Day 1. No sleep drill, 4 hours minimum. I've been waiting, she said cheerfully, for someone to give us a real reason. I did not smile then. I would smile later when we had something to smile about. Daejung pulled up beside us as we turned the corner, his long stride easy and unhurried. I watched the last 3 years of War Games footage on the transit here, he said. The Keth run a perfect bracket formation. Same entry vector every time. Same 3-phase logistics pattern. Beautiful, actually. Beautiful, Yusuf repeated. Beautiful and fixed, Daejung said. Fixed means predictable. Predictable means we have somewhere to start. Behind us, the laughter of the hall had faded completely. Around us, the academy hummed with the noise of thousands of cadets returning to their routines. Ahead of us, 21 days waited like an unlit room we were about to walk into. I thought about what Drath Voss had said, a mercy exercise. That was what he called facing us. A chance to give the humans a fair look before putting them against real competition. He had trained his whole life to win. He had never once had to train to survive being dismissed. He wanted cadets. He got us. He had no idea those 2 things were not the same. The first drill started at 2 in the morning. Not because we had to. Nobody scheduled it. There was no instructor standing over us with a clipboard and a frown. It was Priya who knocked on doors at 1:57, and it was the shared, wordless agreement of 4 people who had decided, without ceremony, that they were going to do something that most people would call unnecessary. We ran for 90 minutes through the lower maintenance corridors of the station. Then we came back and ran simulations until 5. Then we slept for 2 hours. Then we got up and did it again. This was how human preparation works, I know, because I have tried to explain it to people who are not human. And they always look at me the way Instructor Seal looked at us when she came to observe on day 4. She stood at the edge of our training bay with her forearms folded and her pale eyes moving across the scene with the expression of someone watching something she needed to document, but did not yet have a category for. We were in the middle of a failed simulation. The scenario was a 3-point objective hold, defend 3 marked positions simultaneously against an advancing force. We had run it 4 times already that morning. We had failed all 4 times. Not because we were making the same mistake. We were failing 4 different ways, deliberately, and after each failure we stopped and pulled it apart like a machine with a broken part, turning each piece over, looking at what gave way first and why. Instructor Seal watched for about 20 minutes before she spoke. "You are aware," she said, "that you are failing." "Yes," Priya said, without looking up from her notes. "You have failed this scenario 4 times. 5. If you count the partial we ran at midnight," Yusuf said. Instructor Seal was quiet for a moment. Most cadets repeat a failed scenario until they achieve success. Then they move forward. I turned around to look at her directly. "We will repeat it until we cannot fail it anymore. There is a difference." She looked at me with those unreadable pale eyes. "Please explain the difference." I thought about how to say it in a way that would translate. "Passing a test means you were ready for that test," I said. "What we are doing means we are ready for the test when everything we counted on has already gone wrong. We are not training for the version of this that goes well. We are training for the version that falls apart in the middle, and we have to finish it. Anyway." She wrote something on her observation pad. She did not say whether it was a positive note or a critical one. She left 20 minutes later, and I did not think much of it at the time. My team. I should tell you about my team, because they were the reason everything that came later was possible. Yusuf Carver was from a small city on the coast of what used to be called West Africa, and he had a kind of stillness about him that most people mistook for patience. It was not patience, it was precision. Yusuf did not waste motion, did not waste words, did not waste thought. When he looked at a problem, he saw it the way a long-range shooter sees a target, not just what was there, but the wind, the distance, the 1,000 small variables between the barrel and the point of impact. He was the quietest person I had ever worked with, and also, when it mattered, the most reliable. Priya Holloway had grown up taking things apart to see how they worked, and somewhere along the way she had started doing it to situations as well as machines. She was the kind of person who got genuinely excited by failure, not because she enjoyed failing, but because failure meant there was something new to learn, and she was absolutely ravenous for new things to learn. She kept 3 separate notes documents running at any given time, and none of them were labeled in any order that made sense to anyone but her. She slept less than any of us, and woke up more alert than any of us, and ate whatever was available without appearing to care what it was. Because eating was just fuel and her mind was somewhere else entirely. Dae-Jung Mercer was the one who made us work as a unit. Not because he was the loudest or the most forceful, but because he thought in layers. When the rest of us were looking at what was directly in front of us, Dae-Jung was already 3 steps ahead and 2 steps sideways, and he had the patience to explain what he saw without making anyone feel slow. He played everything like a long game. He was also, for the record, extremely funny in a completely dry way that crept up on you. And in the middle of the hardest stretches of preparation, he would say something so precise and so quietly absurd that it broke the tension without breaking the focus. And there was me, Mira Vasquez. I had come from a family with 4 generations of military service, and I had grown up understanding that the space between what you can do and what you will do under pressure is the only thing that actually matters. I was a decent tactician, a better leader than I was a fighter, and I had a very high tolerance for being uncomfortable, which had turned out to be the most valuable trait I owned. Together we were not the strongest team at the academy. The Keth were stronger. The Vral were smarter on pure processing speed. The Soon were faster. We knew this. We had looked at the numbers and we did not argue with the numbers. But numbers measure what you are. They do not always measure what you are willing to do. By day 7 we were running on 5 hours of sleep and nobody complained. By day 10, We had cross-trained into each other's roles so thoroughly that Yusuf could cover Priya's technical work in a reduced capacity, and Dae-jung could run primary tactics if I went down. We had done it deliberately, and it had cost us sleep and comfort and several arguments that got loud before they got resolved, and we were better for all of it. The arguments are worth mentioning. We had 3 serious ones in 21 days. The first was about resource allocation in a long-hold scenario. Yusuf wanted to conserve, I wanted to spend early and move fast, and we went at it for 40 minutes, before Dae-jung put both positions on a board, and showed us where they intersected, and the answer was neither us and both of us at the same time. The second was about whether Priya's tunneling theory, her idea about exploiting terrain mechanics in the war game's environment, was worth the time investment. I thought it was too uncertain. She thought I was wrong. She was right. The third argument was about whether Dae-jung needed more sleep, and that one ended with him proving his point by running the next simulation better than any of us. None of these arguments broke anything. They built something instead. We learned exactly where each of us bent and where we held, and by the end of 3 weeks we knew each other well enough that in the field we could share information with a glance and a word because the long version had already been said so many times it was stored. I found out later, from another cadet who heard it from a Keth support officer, that Drath Voss had received a scouting report on our training sessions around day 12. His response, when told we were running sleep-deprived drills and deliberately engineering failures, was reportedly this: "They are disorganized. It will be easy." I think about that sometimes. The way a perfectly trained mind, shaped by centuries of disciplined tradition, can look at something unfamiliar and call it disorder, because it does not fit the pattern they know. Drath Voss had trained his whole life in a system that valued perfection and efficiency and clean execution. He looked at us, thrashing through failures at 2 in the morning, and saw mess. He could not see what we were building inside the mess. He had no reference for it. There is a reason humans train the way we do. It is not tradition. It is not philosophy. It is something older and more honest than both. For most of human history, we did not have the luxury of training for the ideal scenario. We trained because things went wrong. We trained because the plan would break and the equipment would fail and the person next to you would go down, and you would have to keep moving with whatever you had left. We trained because losing was never a thing we could afford to believe in, not when there was still something left to fight for. We carry that. It is in the preparation, in the refusal to stop, in the way we argue with each other and then close ranks. It looks like chaos from the outside. From the inside, it feels like building something that will not come apart. On the last night before the games, we did not run drills. We sat in the mess and we ate a proper meal, and Dae-jung told a story about the worst navigation exercise he had ever survived, which involved 3 wrong turns and a malfunctioning compass and a swamp, and by the end of it Priya was laughing so hard she had to set her cup down. We went to sleep at a reasonable hour. We were ready, not because we had done everything right, because we had done everything wrong, over and over, until the wrong things ran out. The war games environment was a flat forested plateau roughly 12 kilometers across, ringed by low ridgelines and bisected by a dry riverbed. The simulation wrapped a real, physical space. The Academy's combat training grounds on the station's outer ring, in live conditions. The weapons fired stun charges that delivered genuine, disabling pain. The terrain did not forgive poor footing. The atmosphere was pressurized and warm, and after about 6 hours it would begin to feel close, the way confined spaces always do. The central objective was a structure called the Command Citadel, set dead in the middle of the plateau. It had walls, elevated firing positions, and a single wide entrance. Whoever held it at the end of 72 hours, or whoever held it when the other team was fully eliminated, won. Simple, clean, brutal. The Keth moved first, as we knew they would. I watched their entry on the overhead sensor feed we were allocated for the first 30 minutes, a standard competitive provision for all teams, stripped away once operations began. They came in from the eastern ridge in a 3-column formation so precise it looked like a diagram. 7 cadets moving as one body, spacing maintained to the centimeter, each covering the next with overlapping fields of fire. Drath Voss was at the point. He moved like something that had been designed specifically for this, and the truth was, in a way, he had. It was beautiful. Dae-jung had been right about that. Perfect spacing, Yusuf said, watching beside me. Same entry vector as the last 4 years. Dae-jung confirmed without looking up. He had the historical footage comparison running on a secondary display. They will move to the northern approach to the Citadel, establish a forward hold at the tree line, and consolidate before the 12-hour mark. They're expecting us to be on the western side, Priya said. Standard position for the lower-seeded team. We are not on the western side, I said. No, she agreed, we are not. We were in the riverbed, not the full team. Yusuf was already moving toward the Keth's rear logistics point, which we had identified from the sensor data as a resupply cache near the eastern ridge. The logic was simple. The Keth formation was powerful and disciplined, and nearly impossible to fight directly. So we were not going to fight it directly. We were going to make it fight itself. The first 6 hours of the war games are not dramatic, at least not from the outside. Other teams clashed to the north and south. We heard the distant crack of stun discharges twice in the first hour. A Darathi squad was eliminated by hour 4. We learned this from the scoreboard pulse that all teams received on the hour. By hour 6, 3 teams were down and the bracket was thinning. We were nowhere on the board. No contact, no eliminations, no points. From the command observation platform where the instructors watched, we must have looked like we had gone to sleep. What we were actually doing was dismantling the Keth's ability to see. Their communication relay was a small, hardened unit near the ridge, standard Keth field kit, encrypted and robust. Priya had spent 2 weeks studying Keth communication architecture, and she had found something that was not quite a weakness, but was close enough. It was not a vulnerability in the encryption. It was a physical limitation in the relay's broadcast range when 2 units were placed within specific proximity to each other. If you put a second relay signal within 40 meters broadcasting on the adjacent frequency band, the primary relay did not fail. It just became slightly consistently maddening to use. Wrong coordinates, delayed confirmations, positioning data that lagged by 12 seconds. 12 seconds is not much. In a perfect formation moving at a walking pace through known terrain, 12 seconds is nothing. In a contested environment where you are receiving fire from an unknown direction and your sub-commander is calling for positioning support, 12 seconds is the difference between a coordinated response and 4 people moving in 4 different directions. Yusuf placed the secondary unit at hour 3. We did not notice results until hour 7. At hour 7, Drathvas sent 2 scouts toward the western sector where we were supposed to be. They found nothing. He sent them back. He adjusted his formation slightly, tightened the spacing, and continued his advance on the citadel. At hour 8, Yusuf took out one of those scouts with a single stun shot from a position in the ridge rocks that he had prepared before the games began. Clean, quiet, and gone before the Keth had finished registering what happened. The scout went down and stayed down, eliminated, and the Keth formation paused. Sub-Commander Vethkal's voice came over the intercepted channel. We had a passive listener on the Keth frequency, another one of Priya's contributions, and he said contact Eastern 1 elimination. Drathvas responded, origin point, a pause. Unclear, positioning data is running delayed. A longer pause. Then Drathvas said very carefully, find them. Vethkal said, we are trying. We were by that point, already somewhere else entirely. The hard part of what we were doing was not technical. It was physical and psychological. 72 hours of continuous operation means you do not stop. You do not check out. You rotate rest in 2-hour windows where one person sleeps while the others hold position and watch. And you do it on terrain that offers no comfort, in air that thickens as the hours pile up, with a team that is slowly accumulating the weight of every hour that has passed. At hour 14, I was running on my second stimulant ration in a deep, grinding tiredness that started behind my eyes and went all the way down to my heels. Yusuf was operating out of a spider hole he had dug by hand in the riverbed clay, invisible to overhead sensors because Priya had patched a thermal screen over the top. Daejung was at a relay intersection 300 meters north, feeding false positioning data back into the Keth channel with a device. Priya, built from components she had quietly borrowed from the Academy workshop over the preceding week. And Priya was in the ground. This is the part that, later, Instructor Seal would write about at length in her academic observation report. Priya had identified, in the 3-dimensional topography of the training environment, a geological feature, a layer of softer substrate beneath the main terrain, running beneath the eastern approach to the citadel like an invisible road. It was not a tunnel. There was no tunnel. She was talking about digging one. 22 hours of progressive excavation, moving at night and in deep cover during the day, working through substrate that gave way in chunks and had to be moved by hand, with the kind of sustained, miserable, unrewarded physical effort that has no value at all unless it works. She had started on day 1 of the games. She was currently 4 hours from the Citadel's inner perimeter wall. I had argued against this, back in training. I had told her it was too slow, too uncertain, too dependent on everything else going right for long enough. She had looked at me with the patient expression of someone who has already run the calculation and knows the answer. "It does not need everything to go right," she said. "It needs everything to go wrong long enough for me to get there." At hour 14, with the Keth formation hunting shadows across a 12-kilometer plateau, everything was going wrong long enough. The Keth hit us at hour 16, not a glancing contact, a real one. They had backtracked the source of Yusuf's shot with old-fashioned patience, no technology, just 3 of their best cadets moving in expanding arcs from the elimination point until they found his spider hole. He heard them coming and had 30 seconds to move. He moved. He did not get out clean. He took a grazing stun hit on his left shoulder that sent a shockwave of numbness down his arm and slowed him enough that he could not make the secondary position we had designated. He went to ground in a dry wash instead behind a rock shelf and held there while the 3 Keth swept past him in the darkness. He did not call for support. I found out later, much later, that he had assessed the situation, concluded that calling in would risk giving away my position in Dae-jung's, and decided to hold alone and quiet. He held for 2 hours. At hour 18, the 3 Keth came back through the wash on their return sweep, and Yusuf, on one functional arm, and the kind of focus that does not have a technical name, took out one of them before the other 2 got his position and eliminated him. The scoreboard updated. 1 human down. The observation platform above us would be very quiet, I imagined. I heard the update in my earpiece and I stopped moving for exactly 3 seconds. Then I kept moving, because that is the only answer. I relayed to Dae-jung. We compressed the plan. Dae-jung's response was immediate and complete. Acknowledged. Compressed. Priya's timeline? 6 hours to the wall, I said. We need to give her 6 hours. Then let's be very loud, Dae-jung said. For the next 6 hours we were. Hour 22 came and the Keth were moving toward the citadel. They had 5 cadets left, Drath Voss and 4 others, including Veth Kal, and they were moving with the careful, disciplined precision of a formation that had been surprised and had recalibrated. Drath Voss was no longer operating on the assumption that we were easy. That was clear from the new tightness in his spacing, the way the formation moved with a sensor sweep running at 5-second intervals. He adjusted. He was still operating on the wrong map. The false positioning data that Dae-jung had been feeding into the Keth channel for the last 15 hours had accumulated into a picture of the battlefield that was slightly, consistently wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Nothing so obvious that a trained commander would catch it immediately. Just the kind of steady, low-grade distortion that, under fatigue and pressure, adds up to a formation that thinks it knows where the threat is and does not. They thought I was north. I was south. They thought Dae-jung was southwest. He was at the eastern approach, moving toward the citadel from the direction they had come from. The citadel was, by hour 22, held by the Keth. They had walked in 3 hours earlier, found it empty, and settled into it. Standard procedure. Defensible walls, elevated sight lines, single entrance. Drath Voss had gone textbook, and the textbook said, "Hold the center." He was waiting for us to come to him. We were going to come to him. Just not from where he was watching. Priya broke through at hour 26. I know because she sent a single short transmission on our channel. 1 word, a technical term for a completed circuit that we had agreed on in training. The word was through. I heard it and I felt something shift in my chest. A kind of locked gear releasing. Dae-jung, I said. Ready, he said. Give me 4 minutes. 4 minutes, he confirmed. The next 4 minutes were the most openly aggressive thing we had done in the entire operation. I moved from the south, with no concealment and no silence, drawing the citadel's eastern wall sensor feeds and pointing to the Keth to turn their attention outward toward me. I took a hit on the shin at minute 2, a clean stun strike that lit up the nerve cluster from ankle to knee and made me limp badly, and I kept moving. At minute 3 and 40 seconds, 2 things happened at nearly the same time. Priya came up through the floor of the citadel's equipment bay, covered in dirt and substrate, and something that might have been clay or might have been exhaustion given physical form. And she immediately began working on the citadel's internal sensor network, with the focused intensity of someone who had been underground for 22 hours and had run out of patience. And Dae-jung hit the eastern gate. The Keth formation, which had been watching south and north and west, spun toward the gate, which left the equipment bay unsecured, which meant Priya's 30 seconds of inside access was uncontested. She killed the internal lights. She killed the positioning overlay on the Keth's tactical displays. She redirected the Citadel's external speaker system to broadcast Keth formation, commands in the wrong sequence, not fabricated ones, real ones, drawn from the historical footage Dae-jung had studied, old commands. Commands that said, fall back to secondary position when there was no secondary position to fall back to. The Keth formation did not break. These were elite cadets, trained to a standard that most species would consider extraordinary, and they did not break under confusion, but they fractured. Two of them moved toward the gate where Dae-jung was pushing. One of them went looking for the source of the command broadcast. Vethkal held his position and swept the room with a handheld light. Drathvos stood in the center of his citadel and looked at the darkness and said nothing. I came through the main entrance 30 seconds later. My leg was wrong from the stun hit. My left side was bruised from a collision with a rock shelf somewhere around hour 18 that I had not mentioned to anyone. I had been awake for 31 hours. I was moving on stimulant rations and something deeper than stimulants, something that does not come from a packet and cannot be measured. The citadel floor was chaos. Dae-jung was engaged at the gate. Priya was somewhere in the dark doing things to the power routing. The remaining two Keth were between me and the back wall. I moved through them. Not cleanly. One of them landed a solid hit on my shoulder that dropped my left arm. But movement is not dependent on arms, and I had trained 3 weeks on what to do when parts of you stopped working. And I kept moving. Drathvos turned when he heard me coming. We looked at each other across the floor of the citadel. He was 7 feet tall and had been bred for this. He was faster than me. His reach was longer. He had trained in Keth martial form since before he could walk, and even exhausted, even in the dark, even in a citadel that was falling apart around him, he was dangerous in the way that genuine excellence is always dangerous. I was shorter, running on one good arm and a sprained ankle and 31 hours of sleep deprivation. I was also the person who had trained on what happens after everything goes wrong. He came at me fast, perfectly patterned, the same 3-step opening sequence from the Keth forms, which I had watched on footage 14 times, and which Dae-jung had drilled me on because he said knowing what was coming was worth more than speed. He was right. I moved wrong on purpose, inside the pattern, not against it, and used the momentum of his third step to redirect rather than block, because blocking a Keth is like trying to stop a wall with your hands. He went past me by 2 steps, and by the time he had turned I was behind him, and the stun contact I placed was low and precise, and everything went dark for Drathvos. He hit the floor. The simulation chimed. The scoreboard updated. Keth commander eliminated. A second chime 20 seconds later. Priya had gotten the last standing Keth with something she built from a power conduit and a great deal of confidence. Dae-jung finished at the gate. The war games were over. I sat down on the floor of the citadel, right where I was, because my legs had delivered me to the destination, and they were not interested in going further just yet. The room was quiet except for the hum of systems coming back online. Somewhere behind me I heard Priya's footsteps, and then she sat down next to me in the dark, covered in 22 hours of underground travel, and did not say anything. Dae-jung came in from the gate and leaned against the wall and let out a long, slow breath. We sat there in the dark of the citadel we had just taken, too tired for celebration, too awake for sleep, and for a little while we just breathed. I had cried a little, I will admit that honestly. Not from sadness, not from relief, exactly. More like the way a pressure vessel releases when the valve opens. My body had been holding something that intense and that focused for 3 weeks, and now it simply did not have anywhere left to put it, so it came out the only way it could. A few seconds, no more. Priya noticed and handed me a water packet without comment, which was exactly the right thing to do. Dae-jung said quietly. Yusuf held for 2 hours on one arm. I know, I said. I want him to know we know. He will, I said. First thing. The lights came back on slowly. The simulation's end sequence restoring the environment to its neutral state. Overhead in the observation space, I imagined the instructors looking at their readouts. I imagined Instructor Seal writing something on her observation pad with 4 careful hands. I thought about Drathvos on the floor behind me, and I felt no satisfaction in the pure sense of the word. He was an excellent officer. He would be an excellent officer his whole career. What happened in this citadel was not a story about him being lesser. It was a story about something he had not seen coming and did not have a framework for. The best thing about a framework, in the end, is that it can be expanded. The lights came fully on. I got up. My ankle complained about it, and I noted that and kept moving. There was still Yusuf to check on, and a debrief to survive, and a team to put back together. We had work to do. The award ceremony was held 3 days later. It was not a small ceremony. The full Academy assembly gathered in the main hall. Same 4,000 cadets, same 11 species, same tiered seating that curved up toward the observation windows where the stars hung behind glass like witnesses. The lighting was formal. The music was something ancient and Union ceremonial, composed by a species that communicated primarily through resonant harmonics, and had produced the official anthem 300 years ago. I stood at the front of the humans section with Priya on my left, Dae-jung on my right, and Yusuf beside him with his left arm in a temporary stabilizing sleeve from the nerve damage he had taken in the riverbed. He was standing straight, and his expression said he would not be making anything of the sleeve, and nobody else should either. The commandant spoke first. Instructor Seal was, as always, impossible to read. She stood at the podium with all four arms at her sides, and her voice came out measured and precise. And for the first part of her address, she covered the standard elements. The games themselves, the performance of all participating teams, the names of eliminated cadets, and the credits owed to them for their service in the exercise. Then she paused. It was a deliberate pause, the kind that a being who has been alive for over 2 centuries uses with full understanding of what it does to a room. We have studied the science and practice of warfare, she said, for 4,000 years. We have documented 600 distinct tactical traditions across every member species of the Union. We have believed, with some confidence, that we understood the limits of what can be done under sustained pressure in a contested environment. She looked at the human section. The events of the past 72 hours have asked us to revisit that confidence. The hall was very quiet. What the human delegation demonstrated was not a superior tactical system. It was not faster processing or greater physical endurance or more advanced equipment. What they demonstrated was the ability to function, to decide, adapt and execute, at a level of degradation that our modeling did not account for, because our modeling assumed that degradation past a certain threshold produces failure. They have indicated that for humans, that threshold is located somewhere we have not yet found. She stopped again. This academy will be revisiting its cadet preparation protocols, she said. Across all species, we will be asking the human delegation to contribute to that process. There was applause then, real applause, from 4,000 voices across 11 species, and it built slowly from a scatter to something full and sustained, and I stood in it and felt it in my sternum and did not entirely know what to do with my face. Beside me, Priya was crying quietly, the way people cry when something they wanted badly turns out to be real. Dae-jung had the expression of someone who had just solved the problem he had set for himself 3 weeks ago and was already thinking about the next one. Yusuf looked at the hall full of applauding people and nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. The Apex War Games trophy was a physical thing. A hexagonal pillar of clear composite material with the winning team's record pressed into it in Union Standard script. We were handed it by the senior Keth instructor on the awards committee, a large, composed officer who shook each of our hands in the human fashion, without any visible reluctance, and said something in the Keth language that the translator rendered as well earned. I thought that was probably the picture of those 2 words I had ever heard. After the ceremony, the formal structure dissolved and the hall became the kind of organized noise that follows large official events. Cadets moving, talking, the hum of 4,000 beings in a space that could hold them. I was standing near the east wall with a drink I had not yet touched when a figure approached from the left. Drathvos was considerably more impressive in person than on a sensor feed, even when he was not moving with the full force of competitive purpose. He was in formal uniform, his silicon plating catching the light, his translator collar adjusted to casual register. He moved through the crowd with the natural authority of someone who had never once had to think about whether they had the right to be somewhere. He stopped 2 meters from me and looked at me for a moment before speaking. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "All right," I said. "How?" It was not a complaint, it was not an excuse. It was a genuine question from a genuinely excellent officer, who had spent 3 days turning something over in his mind, and had decided that the honest thing was to ask directly. I respected that, I told him so. "I watched the full sensor record," he said. "I saw the sleep data from your preparation period. I saw what your team was operating on by hour 60. I know what my team was operating on by hour 40. In any objective comparison, we should have held that citadel." "You should have," I agreed. "On paper." "Then explain the paper to me." I thought about how to say it truthfully without making it a lecture or a performance. He deserved a real answer. "You train to win," I said. "That is not a criticism. That is the right way to train for most things. You built a system that optimizes for victory under expected conditions, and you refined it until it was nearly perfect. When we came at you with unexpected conditions, your system had to adapt in real time, which it was not built to do because it had never needed to. And yours was. Ours was built on the assumption that expected conditions are a luxury," I said. We are a young species in this galaxy. We have been here 40 years. Before this, for most of our history, we were alone on one planet, and that planet was not always kind, and the conditions were almost never expected. He was listening, not performing listening, actually listening, the way you listen when you are taking something apart to understand it. We have been at war with each other, with disease, with failure of food and infrastructure, and everything civilizations need to survive. For most of our recorded history, I said, we did not have centuries of stable development. We broke and rebuilt and broke again. The way we train now is a memory of that. It is a memory of needing to keep going after everything reliable was gone. That is a very hard way to exist, Drath Voss said. Yes, I said. It made us very hard to stop. He was quiet for a moment. Then your teammate, the one in the riverbed, Yusuf. He held a position against 3 of my cadets alone on a compromised arm for 2 hours. In the dark, yes. Not because he was ordered to. No, I said. Because he decided the alternative cost more than staying cost him. Drath Voss looked at me with something in his expression that I did not have a word for but that I recognized. It was the look of someone who has just seen something that does not fit their previous understanding of the world, and is making room for it instead of pushing it away. I would like to train this way, he said. I do not think I know how. Nobody does the first time, I said. You figure it out by doing it wrong until you can't. He held out his hand in the human fashion, because he had clearly gone to the trouble of learning it, and I shook it. I found Instructor Seal 15 minutes later, or rather she found me, appearing at my shoulder the way very old, very observant beings do when they have been waiting for the right moment. I owe you an observation, she said. You do not owe me anything. Academically, she said, when you told me on day 4 of your preparation that you trained until you could not get it wrong, rather than until you got it right. I noted it as an interesting philosophical distinction. I did not fully understand it as a practical one. And now I have 72 hours of sensor data that is the most extensive documentation of that distinction I have ever encountered. She tilted her head slightly, and what I had learned was a Vral gesture of acknowledgement. The Academy's Preparatory Review Board meets in 6 weeks. I would like you to present. Present what, specifically? Everything, she said. The methodology, the philosophy behind it, the history that produced it. There are commandants from 14 other academies on that board, and what they are going to hear is that a species with 40 years in this galaxy has found an approach to combat readiness that 4,000 years of collective military doctrine missed. I thought about that for a moment. We did not find it, I said. We inherited it from every generation that had to keep going anyway. Then tell them that too, she said. That is perhaps the most important part. She left me with that, and I stood for a while in the noise of the hall, watching 4,000 cadets from 11 species move and talk and exist in the complicated, imperfect, occasionally magnificent project of learning how to work together. Later that evening, I sent a message home. My mother is retired infantry, 2 decades of service, 3 deployments, a knee that gave her trouble in cold weather, and a way of looking at problems that was the most direct thing I had ever learned from anyone. She had sent me off to the academy with a single piece of advice. Show up every day like you plan to be there at the end. I had tried to do that. The message I sent her was short, not because the story was short, but because she would understand the short version better than anyone. They asked cadets, I wrote. We showed up. The rest you'll see on the news. Her reply came back in 4 minutes, which given the signal delay between my location and hers was impressively fast, and told me she had been watching the news already. That's my girl, she wrote. Get some sleep. I put the message away and looked out the observation window at the stars. We came to this galaxy as the new ones, the soft ones, the ones who were 40 years old in a community that measured its traditions in millennia. We walked into rooms where our presence was a courtesy extended to a young species that had not yet proved itself. And we sat in the back and listened and learned and watched. And we trained in the hours when the station was quiet and the others were resting. And we argued with each other in the dark and closed ranks when the light came. We were not conquerors. We were not the strongest or the fastest or the oldest or the most refined. We were a species that had been broken and rebuilt so many times that the breaking and rebuilding had become a kind of fluency, a language we spoke without thinking, a skill so deep it looked like stubbornness from the outside. The galaxy had let us through its doors and given us a seat at the table and waited, with the patience of ancient institutions everywhere, to see what we would do with it. Now it knew, not what we had done in one war game on one station, on one long, terrible, beautiful, difficult night. It knew what we carried with us. What all of us carry, every human who walks into a room where we are the newest face, the smallest delegation, the ones who are here by invitation rather than inheritance. We carry every ancestor who had nothing and kept going, every person who faced something impossible and did it anyway. Not because they were certain they would succeed, but because the alternative was to stop. And stopping was the one thing they had been given no permission to do. Instructor Seal was right. That was the most important part. The Keth would train differently now. Other species would look at their protocols and reconsider. Somewhere in 6 weeks there would be a boardroom of military educators on 14 worlds having a conversation about sleep deprivation drills and deliberate failure and what it means to build something that holds when everything else is gone. I was glad. Not because humans needed the galaxy to catch up, but because the best version of what the Union could be was all of us, every species, carrying the best of what we had figured out and putting it in front of each other. That was worth showing up for. I picked up my trophy from where I had set it down on the windowsill. The stars were very clear through the composite glass, and the station was turning slowly on its axis, and somewhere behind me the hall was still full of noise and life. I had been awake for a very long time. I went and got some sleep,